the afternoon session. So as I say, we heard from Dundee this morning, how are we got this going on in Dundee. This afternoon we're going to hear from the other authorities. We're going to hear from Diane, who's going to tell us what's going on in Renfrewshire. We're going to hear from Annette, who's going to tell us what's going on in Aberdeenshire. And we're going to hear from Becky, who's going to tell us what's going on in Argyll and Bute. But before, and we'll get some chance for the sake of some table discussion after that. Beforehand, however, there are 32 local authorities in Scotland, and today we're only really hearing from the front from 4 of them. So just for a few minutes before we get to hear what's happening elsewhere, I'm just going to give you an overview of how lived experience has been included in the local child poverty action reports for the whole of Scotland, for all the 32 authorities. I'll cover 3 things. Well, first of all, just remind us what local child poverty action reports are, what they're about. I'll then describe what we did in terms of analysis we undertook, and then I'll just draw 10 conclusions from that analysis that we've done, looking at over the piece, the 32 authorities, how lived experience has been handled. So to begin with then, local child poverty action reports, I do apologise for those whose life is writing, reading and analysing these reports, but I think there's no harm in just giving a reminder of what they're about. They are a statutory requirement. It's an obligation put on local areas in Scotland. Each of the 32 areas on an annual basis must report on what's been undertaken locally to tackle child poverty. And they are collaborative documents between the local council and the local health board, with an expectation, of course, that the work doesn't just stop with council and health board, but it involves everybody, third sector partners, social enterprises, etc., private enterprise that's involved in tackling poverty. They are to review and to be prospective, so that also what's going forward. And the action, something we heard about this morning, is what they're meant to be. It's not just a description, but they're very much an action. This is where we are taking the agenda, this is what we want to do. Not all of the relevant actions are included in local reports. In a document, you can't encapsulate everything that's going on locally to tackle child poverty. But we might reasonably expect that these local action reports tell us what the priorities are locally. I think that's a fair point. It can't cover everything, but it should tell us what we consider the most important challenges in our local area. And that will differ. The 32 local authorities in Scotland are very different in character, very different in nature of challenges. So we wouldn't expect them all to be the same. We'd expect some sort of variation in there. I think what's interesting in these reports, and particularly in the last few years, is that they began to change in character. I think from the early part, and we're now the 6th iteration of these reports. 2018-19 was the first set of reports. The most recent ones related to 23-24, that's the 6th round. Initially then they were very much standalone reports. It was this is this year, this is what we did, this is what we're going to do next year. But they're beginning to change in the last few years. Some authorities have incorporated a local child poverty action report within their children's services plan. Other local authorities have incorporated their child poverty report within a broader poverty plan. And some authorities are providing an update to a strategy that covers more than 1 year, as well as those that are still report on their annual report. So they are important, but they are nevertheless just documents. I think we heard this morning, the most important thing is the actions that are in those documents. So what did we do then? Well, we at the unit at the Scottish Poverty and Inequality Research Unit maintain a database of the content of these reports. A bit geeky, if I'm honest about it. We basically, we count the number of times words are mentioned. We do that for all different things, for transport, for employability, for housing, and for lived experience is one of the features that we looked at. So we searched the documents to find out how many times lived experience was mentioned, or how many times people, children or adults experiencing poverty was mentioned, to give us a feel for the extent to which it's prevalent in the local reports. As well as doing a count of the number of times it was mentioned, we also looked through the reports for testimony, how many times or how often and how prevalent the words of people experiencing poverty permeate these reports. Bear in mind, of course, something we talked about this morning, it's not just about saying what's going on or describing how bad the problem is. What we're more interested in is how we can find the solutions to these problems. And then we reviewed all of those mentions of lived experience. We went into the documents and found out what they were saying about it and what they were doing. So 177 reports is what we've analysed, not just last week. We built this up through time, and we can draw some conclusions to give us a sense of overview. We can do it for all different topics. We've drafted one on childcare, we've drafted one on large families, and this third briefing is focusing on lived experience. So 10 things, 10 summary comments, and I have to say that the document I'm referring to, we'll make that available in a few weeks' time. I think with permission of Peter, whoever's the listener who attended here, we're happy to send that document out to you so you can get a sense of what's in there. What is in there actually is as well as a summary overview, we've got a summary of each of the 32 local authorities, how lived experience has been covered in each of the 32. So we've got a real sense of how important this issue is in Scotland. So 10 points to make there. First of all, in terms of coverage, the majority of these 177 reports mention lived experience, but we might be a little bit surprised given what we heard this morning and what we hear this afternoon, is that many of them don't. And about 1 in 7 of the reports actually don't mention lived experience at all. And some of the mentions, or some of the coverage of lived experience is a little bit cursory. So while we're here today to really celebrate and learn the good practice, I think we have to also understand that it's not necessarily central to the approach to tackling poverty locally in some of the 32 local authorities. As I said, point is the context. There is acknowledgement of the encouragement. The Poverty and Inequality Commission very early on had said that they wanted much more these reports to be much more embedded with lived experience than was the case in the early reports. Many local authorities reflected that. They made specific reference to the fact that they acknowledged the Poverty and Inequality Commission were happy and they were doing something about it. There's also some references to national standards for community engagement and the work of Greg Heard as well. So there is an understanding of the broader context in some of these reports. But interestingly, nobody mentioned actually it was an encouragement, or obligation, you might even argue, of the Initial Act. The Initial Act in 2017 did expect that lived experience would be something that informed and shaped how policy and practice was delivered in our local areas. And that's not something that was acknowledged in the reports. Third point to make, and it's done as a case in point here, that some authorities pointed out that some of their work and lived experience predated the 2017 Act to tackle child poverty. It was something they were already doing, something, if you like, they believed was rooted in local practice. Fourth point is it's quite clear that when we do talk about lived experience, there is an explicit acknowledgement of the value of listening and the value that comes in understanding poverty better when we listen to those with lived experience. That's very clear, and a strong reason for why lived experience is engaged is to better understand the nature of the challenge. Fifth point, and perhaps less positively, is there are few actions related to lived experience. These are action reports. The whole point of the report is not just to describe what's going on, but to say this is the actions we're going to take to improve it and make things better. And while some local authorities had specific actions in relation to engaging lived experience more often, it was something that was more in the background of the context rather than quite clearly at the heart of the strategy and what we're going to do. A sixth point, there were some examples, but limited examples of this lived experience work actually shaping policy and practice. There are a few examples of it, where in the report it's explained how when we engage lived experience, this is the impact that it's had. But very often it's a case of we're going to engage lived experience to better understand, but not really explaining the impact that that had. So falling a little bit short in evidencing the impact of lived experience, I think it's perhaps the strongest criticism we could make of the coverage in these reports. There's not enough done to demonstrate why this matters and to show how it matters, how the difference that follows from it. The seventh point is it's also not always clear that when we're talking about engaging with lived experience, we're actually talking about engaging with people with lived experience of poverty. So some of the ways in which authorities were justifying engaging lived experience was almost generic. It was talking about community-lived engagement or engaging children and young people without sharply understanding and focusing on what those who were engaged and were sharing a lived experience had lived experience of poverty. Now that's not to say that you want to isolate people or shine a light on them because they experience poverty, but I think it's incumbent upon us, if we're interested in the voice of lived experience, to make sure we're the right people around the table. And it wasn't always clear in the reports the steps that we've taken to achieve that. An eighth point is that primarily when we talk about lived experiences of engaging adults, but there's also some good examples in there about attempts to engage children in lived experience too. I'm sitting at the table with folk from North Lanarkshire, so they're going to encourage me to mention the Ask 3 Children Questions approach to take locally, which is an example then of going into schools, asking 3 simple questions to children and young people about poverty, and then trying to think about how that can shape policy and practice. So there are good examples out there on engaging with children that largely what we're talking about is engaging adults. The ultimate point then, there's a variety of structures out there, and I'll give you a few. I say, well, there was uneven coverage. I think through time, increasingly, lived experiences feature in these reports, and the shape of the structures differs in certain authorities. We've heard it in Dundee this morning. We know that pillared approach, how it's very much central to how Dundee shapes policy. In Aberdeen, it's described that there's a council committee, it's informed by external advisors, some of whom have lived experience. So in Aberdeen, they've got a committee that's, as described in the local chair of the action report, you have a committee then that is primarily responsible for making decisions, and have an external advisor panel that feeds into that, and some of them have lived experience. Aberdeenshire, we'll hear more about from Annette, but they have pause for breath, a list of the things they do. Local Voices Forum, a Child Poverty Conference, a Lived Experience Forum, and a Youth Board and Lived Experience Charter. So a range of ways in which in Aberdeenshire, I'm sorry for stealing the thunder here.
It's okay, I don't have to do my
In Angus, they've developed an app to specifically get the views of children who are care experienced, a My Views app, as well as again an event, a hard edges event to capture that lived experience. In Clackmannanshire, it's quite interesting that in their foreword to one of their local child poverty action reports, both the chair of the local health board and the chair of the council mentioned that lived experience is central to how we tackle poverty in Clackmannanshire. So that local leadership sense that this is how we will go about it is headlined in that report. In East Ayrshire, they make reference to that Children and Young People's Cabinet. Again, there's no specific clarification about whether that Children and Young People's Cabinet involves children who have lived experience of poverty. In East Lothian, they refer to a Working for Change collective, and it's described that that collective then heavily shapes the nature of policy through voice. And in West Lothian, they have Children's Anti-Poverty Champions, or at least they did have Children's Poverty Anti-Champions, because it was mentioned in 3 of the last 4 reports, but wasn't mentioned in the final report there. And maybe that's something to think about as well, is whether or not our examples are successful. It's really important, I think, to share that practice and learn from what didn't work so well if we want to introduce the practice that works. So they're just some of the examples from some of the authorities. And I say in that briefing that there's a full list of the range of ways in which the authorities are or are not embracing lived experience in the work that they do. A final point to make is we rather cheekily classify local authorities in terms of the extent to which over these 6 reports lived experience is featured in their local child poverty action reports. I think it's been consistently prominent in 3 authorities. No surprise to us, Dundee, Aberdeenshire and North Ayrshire are 3 authorities that from the very go, from the very start of the local child poverty action reports, lived experience has been central to that local vision of how poverty has been tackled. There's 4 authorities where we think it's actually given increasing prominence through time, so lived experience became more important as we progressed through reports. There are 7 authorities that we think is a bit inconsistent. Some years it's got a lot of prominence, other years it doesn't. 7 authorities where it's a consistent, quite a low focus. There are 4 authorities it's irregular, but sometimes it's more prominent, sometimes it's not. There are 5 authorities where actually lived experience seems to have been slightly less prominent in more recent reports, but that might also reflect the fact that recent reports are changing in character, that I mentioned earlier. If it's embedded within a broader report, then perhaps there's less space to talk about the one that's going on lived experience, because the broader reports will concern everything to do with children's services, for example. But the final point to include on, and leaving a Grinch, I'm going to end on a slightly negative note, just to get a bit of balance to the day. There are 9 authorities in Scotland that are consistently low focus, where the coverage of lived experience in the report has been something that's just in the margins rather than central to it. So what we're here to do, of course, is to learn from practice and to try to develop it going forward, but we should be very aware that while celebrating that practice, there's much to do in many parts of Scotland if we want to work better with that. So I'm very happy, and I will be happy to share that report with you. It's merely the opinions of the unit and the bringing together the evidence. But as I say, we are hearing from 4 stellar authorities today. It's important to think about the other 28 and what's going on there as well. Now, I'm happy to take a couple of questions if anybody's got any, and if not, I'll move on to introduce our first speaker. Anybody get any questions about that overview of what's going on in Scotland? Splendid. So we will move on. As I say, we will get a chance to ask questions in the presentations. First of all, we're going to hear from Diane, who's going to share her experience of working in Renfrewshire. I'll just read out from the sheets in front of you. So Diane will cover how the Fairer Renfrewshire panel is set up, how it works, buy-in and reflections from a third sector part of the panel, as well as some of the panel's achievements. And I've managed to do that just in perfect time with Diane comes to the stage.